When I'm asleep, my brain is still in motion.
I sort of see it like little pieces of fiber that are connecting.
It's incredible how active my mind is when I'm supposed to be laying asleep.
When I'm asleep, my brain is active and going around.
When I'm awake in the day, my brain is like this. When I go to sleep at night, my brain is like this.
Just waking up, awake, and sleeping kind of tapers off to this just waking up point again.
When you're asleep, you're pretty much awake, but you don't know it.
When I'm asleep, I think my cells are resting.
Your brain needs time to recover and rest and let synapses heal.
I think the stress is just too great for us nowadays. If we don't get a minimum of 7 hours sleep, we're in serious trouble.
My body needs rest. It needs to take off its job. It does a lot.
Sometimes I'm willing to face things when I'm asleep that I might not really want to deal with when I'm awake.
Maybe sort of a kind of a sexual dream, if you will, with maybe someone it shouldn't be with.
Maybe I'm attracted to somebody, and in my dreams, I'm really flirtatious. Then if I come across this person again, I think I'll flirt a little bit more.
My dreams sometimes are just like maybe scenes from stuff I watch, you know, like Star Wars or Batman the Animated Series. And so I'm seeing like scenes from it. It's like scene after scene after scene. It's like
I was sort of driving around in a small clown car for some reason, talking to Albert Einstein, Newton, and I remember specifically them telling me that 2 + 2 did not equal 4.
I'm falling through like an endless hole, and I actually feel like if I'm actually falling.
Well, that's a good question.
Where does my mind go?
I don't really know.
The mind is searching for solutions.
Can't be on all the time.
My mind's awake, but I'm sleeping. I don't know about dreams.
I think it's important.
Maybe it's not that important.
Sleep and dreams are such an insight into yourself and your own challenges.
Amazing.
Hello, I'm Carl Zimmer. Thank you all for coming out for this evening of an exploration of sleep. I'm sure that all of you, like myself, have asked a lot of those questions that we just saw. And actually, tonight, we're going to be able to talk with 3 of the world's experts on sleep, people who study sleep for a living, and in 3 really remarkably different ways. We're going to learn about how animals sleep. How does a bird sleep exactly? We're going to eavesdrop on a rat's dream. And we're also going to watch what happens when human sleep goes really, really wrong. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. The first one is Dr. Niels Rattenberg. Dr. Rattenberg has made groundbreaking discoveries. Dr. Rattenberg's made groundbreaking discoveries on the animal sleep, including birds. He's at the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology in Germany. He's taken a red eye to join us, but he seems to be absolutely awake. Our next panelist will be Dr. Matthew Wilson. Dr. Wilson is a neuroscientist at MIT and a researcher at the Pickauer Institute for Learning and Memory, where he has the particular expertise of eavesdropping on rat dreams. And our final panelist will be Dr. Carlos Schenk. Dr. Schenk is a renowned sleep clinician. He's a psychiatrist, and he's a researcher at the Minnesota Regional Sleep Disorder Center, where he specializes on bizarre sleep behavior. So let's have a round of applause for all our panelists. And I'd also like to say hello to everyone who's watching on the live stream. You're in the audience here. You're part of a much bigger group, and we welcome you all. So, Niels, I thought we could start by talking to you about human sleep and animal sleep. And I believe you brought a really nice picture of a human and a coral to kind of put this into context, if we could have that picture. So here we have two animals, the human, us, and a coral. Maybe you could tell us a bit about sleep in the animal kingdom. I mean, we all have seen our dogs or cats sleep, but I mean, how widespread is sleep among animals?
Yeah, well, one approach to understanding the purpose of sleep in our brain and sleep in general is to look at how different types of animals sleep. Do all animals sleep the same way? Are there some animals that don't sleep? And by studying animals ranging from simple organisms such as this brain coral to more complex organisms, we may gain insight into the function of sleep both in general and in our brain.
So does a coral sleep?
Well, they retreat into their calcium house in the daytime, so these corals might actually be sleeping while the awake, I presume awake human is observing them.
Right. And flies?
There's a lot of work studying fruit flies in the last 10 years, and they've been shown to clearly engage in sleep. They have many parallels with sleep in humans, sleep in mammals. Their sleep becomes more fragmented when they get older. There are changes in the brain chemistry and expression of genes that are very similar to those in humans. And this is proven to be a very powerful organism in which to try to gain insight into the function of sleep. Because in the fruit fly, you can manipulate the genome. You can turn genes on, you can turn genes off, you can induce mutations and look at how that affects their sleep. And if you find some gene that's very interesting that affects their sleep, then you can look in mammals to see if it plays a similar role, and that can give us clues to the purpose of sleep.
Now, you study a much closer relative to us than brain coral. You study birds.
Yes.
How did you get interested in studying birds, and why do you think they're important for helping us to understand sleep in general?
Yeah, I actually worked first with humans and then went to study birds. And birds are an extremely exciting group in which to study sleep because they're the only taxonomic group that has evolved sleep patterns very much like ours and those observed in the rest of the mammals.
Why don't you tell us about what our basic sleep pattern is, and then talk about how birds are like that?
Yeah, so in humans and other mammals, we engage in two general types of sleep, and these are measured by looking at changes in brain activity in the sleeping human. There is REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep. During this state, the brain actually is exhibiting a pattern of activity that's very similar to that observed when we're awake. But we're unresponsive, we're clearly asleep. Then there's another state called non-REM sleep, which the brain waves are markedly different. When you look at the brainwave activity of a bird that's sleeping, they do the same thing. They exhibit both these states. They have REM sleep, their eyes dart around, their brain is very activated, very much like when they're awake. They lose some muscle tone, just like we do. Maybe if you have a cat, sometimes if they sleep on top of a television, when they enter REM sleep, they lose muscle tone and they roll off the TV and fall on the floor. That's one way to see this at home.
Try it out.
Try it at home, yes. And if you have, dogs will often move their paws and whimper as if chasing rabbits, and they're in REM sleep. But so these two sleep states that we have, birds have them also. And they don't have similar sleep states because they share a common ancestor that had the same sleep states. They seem to have evolved these patterns independently.
So mammals get the REM, non-REM sleep, birds get it too.
Yeah, so the closest living relatives to birds are the crocodiles and other reptiles. And they don't show these two distinct states. They clearly sleep.
Crocodiles probably don't dream, or at least the way we
I
do.
don't know.
We'll find out.
But
so, and now you found one really amazing difference between us and birds, which is, I mean, when we go to sleep, the lights are all out in the sense that our whole brain is involved in sleep, whereas with birds, it's not always the case, right?
Yeah, birds can do a very interesting thing, and that is they can sleep with one eye open. This had been observed decades ago, but nobody had really addressed what was the function of sleeping with one eye open. Now, this might seem like an obvious question, and the obvious answer would be that they're watching for something dangerous while sleeping. You can imagine that sleeping is a very dangerous state to engage in, especially if you live with predators. And so we were interested in testing whether birds use this to watch for predators. And maybe I can just back up 1 second and talk about the image that's currently on the screen. For many animals, there really is this fundamental conflict between the need to be awake and also the need to get their sleep. An interest in this conflict dates back thousands of years, as shown in the legend depicted in this piece of art. According to this legend, in order to stay safe while sleeping, one crane in a group would stay awake holding a stone. And if he started to fall asleep, he would relax and drop the stone, and thereby awaken everybody. That's how they were thought to keep themselves safe. Now, there's absolutely no scientific evidence that cranes do this. But as I was discussing, birds can sleep with one eye open. And when they have one eye open, the half of the brain connected to that eye is kind of in a awake or slightly drowsy state. And so we were interested in learning whether they can actually choose when to sleep this way or when to sleep with both eyes closed, because they don't sleep only this way. They spend a lot of time sleeping with both eyes closed. And so what we wanted to do was find a way to make them feel a little nervous when they were sleeping.
Just a little edgy.
A little edgy. And so we thought about various ways, you know, show them a cat or something. And while we were trying to figure out how to test this, I was observing some of our ducks that we were studying in the laboratory, and I saw that 2 of them at night were floating in the water next to each other. And while they were doing that, they were closing the eye that faced each other and opening the eye that was facing out from each other. And that, right then and there, the birds designed the experiment for us. People often say, oh, that's such an elegant study, and I have to say, well, it came from a bird brain. So.
Did you acknowledge the ducks in your paper?
No. So
this is the experiment, kind of the way you set it up?
Yeah, the upper image shows the actual experimental apparatus. And so what we did is we literally put our ducks in a row. And we did this because it's been shown in many animals that the animals at the edge of a group spend more time being vigilant. Like antelope in Africa, if they're at the edge of the group, they lift their head up and interrupt their feeding more frequently than the ones in the center. Presumably, the ones at the edge feel more exposed and more at risk of being eaten because the predator would get them first. So we put our ducks in a row, and what we found was a very dramatic effect of where they were in the group. The birds that were in the more central positions, that were flanked by ducks on either side, they spent most of their time sleeping with both eyes closed and both halves of their brain. But when the birds were positioned at the end of the row, they switched, and they spent much more time sleeping with one eye open, and they showed a profound preference for directing that open eye away from the other birds, as shown in the cartoon at the bottom. So this clearly showed that they have this capacity to sleep with one eye open, and that it serves a function in allowing them to get some sleep without getting eaten.
And I believe we have an image of a seal as well, if we could show that, because this isn't just limited to birds. I mean, so there are other situations where animals will switch off.
Yeah, this seems to be a common trait among birds, but among mammals, this type of sleep is only found in marine mammals. It's found in the cetaceans, the dolphins and whales, in some of the seals, like the fur seal shown in this image, and also in manatees. And in the case of this image, it's a fur seal, and what they do is they have the awake half of their brain, in this case the right half, that's attached to the flipper down in the water. And that flipper paddles and keeps them in a position that allows them to keep their nose above the surface. And that way they can sleep and breathe at the same time. And this needing to sleep and breathe seems to be probably what's driving drove the evolution of this type of sleep in marine mammals.
And so we mammals can afford, we sort of land mammals can afford to sleep with our whole brains?
Yeah, it seems that there must be some trade-off for being able to sleep this way. Otherwise, I would expect it to be much more common in the animal, among mammals. But it seems to be restricted to these mammals living in a marine environment. However, there is evidence, even in humans, that sleep can be a local phenomena in the brain. Although behaviorally we're fully asleep, parts of the brain can sleep more deeply than other parts at the same time. And a lot of our current thoughts about the function of sleep and based on this local aspect of sleep were derived from these studies with the marine mammals. And this modulation of sleep intensity locally in the brain seems to be related to how we use certain parts of the brain during wakefulness.
So a region we might be using a lot might go into a deep sleep when we're asleep?
Yeah, so if somebody did a certain task with their hand, that part of the brain connected to that will sleep more deeply afterwards. And you can even do the opposite. And there are studies showing that if you immobilize an arm for a day, then the part of the brain that controls that arm shows lighter sleep that night.
So we're clearly getting something out of sleep, and in a way, some of the demands in our waking life make us need to get more of it for those particular areas. So there's something about sleep. Is it restoring our energy? I mean, why would a coral or a fly need to sleep like we do too? I mean, what's the currency there that we all want?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one thing to keep in mind is that sleep may have had an initial primordial function, perhaps in these coral or other simple organisms, but that once an animal was sleeping, and as they became more complex, other functions may have accumulated during the course of evolution. So sleep in humans and sleep in birds may not be the same as in these animals. But I think to get back to birds, I have a bird bias, I kind of like them, but
that's okay here.
This fact that they independently evolved similar sleep states, it really is an opportunity to understand the function of these states. If we can figure out what it is that a bird brain has in common with a human brain, that should give us clues to what the function of these states are.
So clearly we have a lot of mysteries still left to figure out, even about human sleep. We actually talked to one of the real pioneers of modern sleep research, Robert Stickold of Harvard Medical School, and posed a few questions to him about sleep. And we're going to show you a video of some of his provocative answers.
There seem to be limits to the resolution of our dreams. So if I ask you to picture a little German shepherd next to a great big elephant, it turns out that if I want to ask you to describe the dog's ears, you have to zoom in on your mind because you don't have the resolution to see it. So it might be that you just don't have enough resolution on your imaginal screen, on your mental image, to see small letters. You can read large letters going by, but try to close your eyes and picture the phrase, "I'm doing fine, how are you?" You sort of can't squeeze it into your mental image. Everybody seems to think that their dreams have great meaning, and that's what makes us so much want to share them. I think what's going on when we're dreaming is that the brain, as opposed to the mind, is going through the events of our days and recalling memories and trying to find associated memories from other times in our life that might be relevant. So if the brain is looking for ways to put things together, you want its bias to be shifted towards, oh, that's really interesting. So when you wake up, the conscious equivalent of that bias shift towards value is to say, wow, that was so meaningful. That's why your husband and my wife wakes up and say, oh, I had the most amazing dream. And I say, that's nice, but what was the great insight? But to them, and to me when I wake up, they seem incredibly meaningful.
So, Matt, I wanted to ask you, I mean, where do we stand now with dream research? I mean, there have been so many ideas over the years. You've had Freud with his ideas and other people who say, oh, that's wrong, dreams are completely random and meaningless. What are dreams?
Well, you know, I think that the kind of work that I do involves not the study of human dreams, but of animal dreams. And you might ask, animal dreams, what does that mean? I mean, how can you tell when an animal is dreaming? You can't wake them up and, you know, give them a dream notebook or ask them what they dreamed, you know, what they dreamt about. You can, but they won't really answer. So you can ask, how could you actually study animal dreams? And the answer is to bypass the mechanisms of dream report and go directly to the source, and that is to record the activity of brain cells while animals are awake and having experience, and then record the activity of the same cells while animals are sleeping, and ask, essentially compare the patterns. Do the patterns that we see when animals are moving through the world, experiencing the world, do they reappear in some form during sleep? So it's a direct measure of both the structure of brain activity, and you know, Niels mentioned that there are those sleep states in which the structure of activity seems to be very different. That's how we define these sleep states. Deep sleep, these slow oscillations, much of the brain seems to, you know, to be moving in lockstep, which is distinct from wakefulness, when many parts of the brain are being driven based upon what you're doing, what you're seeing. In other words, the brain, when you're awake, is responding to the external world. The brain during sleep seems to be responding to some internal world. So how can we get at this internal world? You mentioned Freud and the idea that maybe we have, you know, different levels, layers, different types of brain activity that correspond to different kinds of cognition. That there is the conscious, the unconscious, those, the deep hidden parts of the brain that might influence behavior, but we can't really articulate. We can't talk about. They're available to us, but how would we actually measure them? So again, the strategy is using an animal model that has actually as its benefit the inability to tell us or to report what they're dreaming.
So the rats don't wake up in the morning and say, "You would not believe the dream I had."
And if they could, you know, the way we would interpret that is that, well, that might be what you thought you dreamt about, but I want to know what you actually dreamt about. And so, again, it would be going directly to the source. So putting very fine electrodes into the brains of animals, and in particular, we focus on a part of the brain that's involved in memory. So you would think, well, I thought we were talking about dreams. Isn't dreams about perception, what we experience? Just a little segue there. We had talked about dreaming. We talked about dream sleep, and Neil mentioned, REM and non-REM sleep. And there's this misconception that dream sleep is really associated with REM sleep.
So REM sleep is with the rapid eye movements,
exactly.
what we all learned.
That's when you see the dogs and the fictive movements. And clearly there is dreaming that goes on there, and I'll discuss a little bit about those kinds of dreams. But there is also dream activity, we can call it dream-like activity, during non-REM sleep. And that is the kind of sleep that would be expressed not just birds, mammals, but in flies, and potentially every organism would have this kind of inactive sleep, non-REM sleep, which, again, I'll point out,
So you're saying flies dream too?
They could dream too. That dreaming is actually it's not the province of a specific dream state. It may be something that actually emerged after the brain found some usefulness in becoming inactive. So what happens when you kind of shut down, you no longer attend to the external world? The brain isn't going to turn off. The brain never turns off. If the brain has turned off, you're either under the influence of an anesthetic that has intentionally suppressed brain activity, or you're in a coma. You are, in a sense, in a state that is unnatural.
So anesthesia is more like a coma than being asleep.
So when you sleep, your brain is very active. It's not shut off in any way, as you saw in some of the subjective descriptions. The kids there talking about their brains during sleep, very active. And it's true, it is very active, but it's active in a very different way.
Maybe we could show some of Matt's experiments next, because they're just really amazing. I mean,
so we'll jump into it.
Yeah.
And just as a little prelude here, so the idea is...
Before we started, why don't you set it up for us?
Right.
So here we are.
So you can imagine you're sitting right now in the lab, because this is exactly what we would see if we were sitting in the lab. And on the right-hand side, you see a top-down. It's a video of what we call a maze. It's a long track. It's like a long hallway. It's about 10 meters long, actually. Pretty long for this rat. It would take this rat maybe a minute or two, actually, to fully go back and forth along this. On the left, what you're seeing is brain activity. Those little flashing lights, each time you see a little flash, that is the discharge of a single brain cell. And the little colored regions indicate different brain cells. So what you're seeing is in real time what, in this case, 2, 4, 6, 8 or 9 individual brain cells are doing, and we'll loop through this again.
Could you loop through that one again for us, the same one?
What these brain cells are doing when an animal's running on this little track. Now, in this part of the brain, this memory part of the brain called the hippocampus, one striking thing that we see is that the pattern that you see on the left is going to depend upon exactly where the animal is on the right. In other words, there's a correspondence between what the brain is doing and where the animal is when the animal is moving. So you can see that on the right, the little dots, or the brain activity, the single discharge of single cells, is mapped onto the maze. So for instance, you see in the lower left, there are lots of blue points. That's because the blue cell, it's not really blue, it's just color-coded that way. The blue cell tends to fire whenever the animal's in that part of the maze. On the other hand, you see the little cyan cell down in the lower right.
And we have I should say we have play cells too. So if, like, I was walking through my house,
exactly.
A play cell would fire as I went past the counter in my kitchen.
So you could say, well, if I'm in there, if I could record the activity of these cells, memory cells or cells that fire in certain places, if I could record them, I might be able to tell just by reading your mind, in a sense, where you are. Well, so if we go to the next video.
Let's go to the next video.
So let's just try that.
Or you read the mind of a rat.
So now it's going to be the same experiment, the same data. You can see on the left, it's the same brain cells firing away. But on the right now, instead of showing you where the brain cells fire when the animal's on the maze, instead, we're decoding the activity. We're guessing where the animal is just by looking at what's going on in the brain. Now, if you watch, when the animal starts walking along the track, see the little triangles there? That's our best guess. as to where the animal is. And it does pretty well. The green circle is just there to kind of show you where the rat is. So our guess, the triangles, fall right on top of the circle, where the animal is. But notice when the animal stops, and maybe we can just rewind. Well, you can actually see here, animal stop, and we'll rewind it. Animal moving, the brain tells you where the animal is. Animal stops, notice where the triangles go. They stop firing, or they stop reflecting where the animal is. You see them, you see that little flash? The triangles jumped across the track. It was just a fraction of a second, very brief. But the brain activity during those brief moments instead reflects not where the animal is, but where it has been or where it could be. The animal is thinking about, in a sense, things that are remote from its immediate experience. Now,
time travel.
Yeah, time travel. The animal just, it's sitting briefly, and what happens in this part of the brain, it's an older part of the brain, the paleocortex, which includes these brain areas that are critical for memory, for emotion, for driving what you might think of as more primitive behavior. Well, this part of the brain can shut off on a dime. In just a fraction of a second, it can go from being actively engaged, taking information in from the outside world, to going into what looks remarkably like sleep. So these memory and emotional areas can go to sleep, while the newer parts of the brain, the neocortex, the part of the brain that's important for keeping track of threats, of monitoring the external world, of making sure you get to where you're going, the part of the brain that has to deal with the outside world, that can be awake, and this other part of the brain can be asleep. So we can think of this state of just thinking, of being inattentive.
Would you call it daydreaming almost?
Now, daydreaming might be if you're sitting there and you say, Wilson is not really interesting anymore. I'm gonna, I'm wondering where did I park my car? Now your mind starts to wander. You start thinking about the memory parts of the brain that can now go back and retrieve past experience. They've got more interesting things.
You've got that parking lot play cell firing.
It's there. But now, the longer you remain in that state, the further out, the more you can actually think about remote from where you are right now. And if you stay in that state long, you say daydreaming, at some point you may actually start to drift off into sleep. You may make a transition from this quiet wakefulness into early non-REM sleep. So you can think of non-REM sleep as emerging, in a sense, from what the brain naturally does when it doesn't have to, it doesn't have to attend to the outside world. That might only last a fraction of a second. It might last 20 minutes. It might last 20 hours. It looks remarkably similar from the perspective of these parts of the brain involved in memory. So somehow, these memory areas are trying to take advantage of this offline state. And if we can just switch to the third video, you can see this. This is going to be the same, basically, it's the same experiment. You can see the activity of these brain cells on the left, but now the animal's not running on the maze anymore. He's not stopped on the maze anymore. On the lower right, that little circle that you see there, that's actually a rat curled up. They kind of sleep in this little curled up posture. There's a rat. He's sleeping. He's off now in another part of the, another part of the room, sleeping. But these memory cells, play cells, are replaying his experience on the maze. They're running through, interestingly, these little sequences, short stretches. It's like a little snippet, a fragment of his experience along the maze. But notice a couple of things. One is, they're very fast. And one thing about these replayed memories during quiet wakefulness and during non-REM sleep is they seem to be compressed in time. They run about 10 times faster than the animal's actual experience. And also, if you look very carefully, notice the direction of that triangle. The direction of the triangle indicates that's the direction the animal would be facing in while it was moving on the track. Well, some of those little memory sequences run in reverse. They go backward in time. So it's as though during quiet wakefulness and during non-REM sleep, the brain has the ability to go back, revisit past memories, to revisit these memories in a compressed form, and it's got a rewind button. It can go forward or backward. So you could ask, why would you want to revisit memories in this peculiar form? You get rid of time, you compress it, and you run it forward and backward. Well, if you think about what's going on during these states, it's not just replaying memory, but trying to do something that we think is probably more fundamental and important to the animals, and that is to learn from experience. How would you learn from your experience? How would you go back, reevaluate, maybe compare different things, as Bob Stickle had mentioned in his little piece, compare different experiences, and to try to figure out the fundamental challenge that we as organisms and we as brains face, and that is, how does this world work? What are the rules of the world? Because I'm going to have to tomorrow, I'm going to have to go out into that world, encounter new things, things that I haven't actually experienced, and I'm going to have to make good decisions. I'm going to have to produce adaptive behavior under novel circumstances, and that's what we can do and robots can't do. They're great when you tell them exactly what to do and when they know exactly, what should be done. You give them anything new, and they simply can't make those critical judgments.
So do we need to program robots so they can dream?
Well, the question is, what would they do if they were dreaming? So clearly, the first step would be, well, let's go back, first form memories of experience where we keep track of a couple of things. One is, we keep track of the order of events as they occurred, because that's very important. Order of events very important. You know, you're at a stoplight, light turns green, you go, all right? That's now, and so in your dreams, you might have this little sequence. Light goes green, cars move. Now, you might extend that. There might be a longer sequence. Okay, the light turns green. If you don't go, people start honking. Okay, so this is now in your dreams, you might be imagining, but now, that might be a simple rule that we would have to learn. But one thing that's very important about these simple rules is one rule doesn't necessarily fit all circumstances. They might be dependent on the context. Context is just, it might be where you are, it might be the time of day. It's all of these additional things that might change the nature of the rule. So, for instance, that rule that I gave you, light turns green, if you don't go, you start honking, okay? That's the general rule. It's the kind of rule that, I might have learned growing up in a small town in northeastern Wisconsin. That rule applies. Now, I come to New York, the rule's a little bit different. It's cars, you start honking, then the light turns green. And so I learned that, right? Different rules, different context. Now, the question is, well, how do you tell a robot how to do that? Well, the robot has to both have experiences in both. It has to be able to remember and be able to express the time ordering of events, figuring out how things actually happen. And then it has to do something that I think is unique. It's unique perhaps to organisms that have exploited sleep. And that's be able to figure out what the significance is of this context. Are there really different rules for different places? Should I combine these? Should I figure out one rule, or are there really two rules?
Well, wait a minute. The thing is that you make dreams sound so practical and so reasonable. In my dreams, there are cactuses that turn into monsters, and I mean, my dreams are crazy. So
well, right. Well, so this is again. So we're back to this misconception.
In New York, cactuses do not turn into monsters.
And that's because what you're describing to me is almost certainly a dream that you experienced during REM.
So
and in REM,
non-REM and REM.
Now, so I didn't illustrate a REM dream, but when we do the same experiment, we measure brain activity during REM, it looks very different. And one of the key differences is there are memories that are replayed, but they're not compressed in time. They don't come in these small little fragments, but rather they're played out in real time, as though the animal is actually experiencing these events. That there are that one can tell, as Neil's pointed out, that when you're awake or when you're asleep, there are very different brain states. And You can tell when an animal is awake by just looking at the way the brain responds. There are these oscillations, rhythms that kick in.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain rhythms that, that correspond to being attentive, to moving in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Other rhythms that correspond to being inattentive. Well, during REM, the rhythms are the rhythms that you would get if you were attending, if you were moving
Mm-hmm.
through the world.
Mm-hmm.
During REM, as far as the brain is concerned, it's awake.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't happen to be moving. And it's in the REM state where now you see it's, you know, the animals are dreaming about things as though they were actually happening.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you know, another point about this, the non-REM. So we go back to the non-REM, where we think of it's more primitive, perhaps, a process of taking memory and experience, trying to learn from it, maybe taking different experiences, comparing them, determining whether, gee, maybe there is this one rule. Maybe it is, you know, light green, you know, you better go or cars will start honking.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's the rule. And everywhere I've gone, that's the rule. But now I come to New York and somehow things are screwed up. Why are they honking? The light is not turned green yet. There's something wrong. Maybe it's a context difference. Maybe you have to figure out what it is about New York City that might, you know, require that I form a special rule, a context-dependent rule. And another thing about the hippocampus, the part of the brain I was talking about, you know, that's involved in memory, that's replaying these things during sleep, and that is that it is critically involved in recognizing context, just knowing where you are, being able to figure out, oh, yeah, I'm, you know, at my home. Why? Because when I put all the pieces together, what I see, what I hear, where I came from, I know where I am. And so you can think about that as something that's very fundamental. Knowing where you are, that may be sort of the anchor for context, different rules in different places. So we have REM, you know, you're running through these longer sequences as they actually experience. In non-REM, you have these little fragments, and when we look at the fragments in non-REM, they seem to relate to pretty much what the animal was just doing. They're more mundane. The animal keeps running through the maze over and over. And so the little fragment that you saw during non-REM sleep, it's mostly slow wave sleep. Slow wave sleep is this slow rhythm, goes on about, you know, once a second. Brain is turning on and off. Niels pointed out different parts of the brain might show stronger rhythms. As you pointed out, parts of the brain that you have really been using. If you were, you know, if you were doing something during the day and you look during sleep, those parts of the brain, maybe the visual parts of the brain, if you're involved in some visual processing, might be going up and down, you know, more vigorously. Well, it's in those little fragments, the little fragment that lasts about a second. That's where you see these small memories being, these, you know, compressed memory fragments being expressed. Now, what's important about that is it says, A, that our experience can be broken up into little chunks. You can think of memory as actually being a series of building blocks that our experience, I kind of think of it like, you know, memory is like a big bag of Lego blocks, you know, where each one of our experiences can be built out of a series of these blocks. Now, unlike Lego blocks, which I can take and I can put together in virtually any way, these memory Lego blocks can only be matched with other blocks in which the peg and the slot, they correspond in some way. They can be associated. Maybe they're linked by a common emotion. Maybe, you know, it's a common location. It's a common cue. So putting together a model of the world out of these memory blocks requires a little bit of attention. You have to go in, you take these little pieces, maybe you try, you know, one piece after, maybe you flip them around and forward, reverse. And once you've built up a model, I've got a new model for, you know, traffic in New York City. Now, that's non-REM. Now maybe I give that model a test run. This might be what REM is involved. So now I have a whole bunch of these memory Lego block models that I've put together. And now as I start to move through them, trying to figure out, well, should I actually have perhaps one model? Do I need two? So moving through these memory models during REM might confer upon them this kind of bizarre confabulatory-like content or structure, because it's not just about revisiting memory or experience, what I've just done. It's not just about, you know, revisiting older memories, but it's putting them together, moving through these models that have been built on memory in ways that attempt to figure out how things are connected. One thing about, you know, in REM, another difference between non-REM and REM sleep states, memory, and these associations, some studies have been done looking at your tendency to connect unrelated things during when people are awakened during REM or non-REM. If you're awakened during REM sleep, you are far more likely to make novel associations, to connect things together. For instance, just given simple word lists, you're far more likely to connect things that were not really related during REM sleep than you are during non-REM. In non-REM, it's pretty much, you know, the way I saw it is the way I remember it.
So this is a great opportunity to jump into Carlos's work. So you're looking at, you started your career, a lot of your research looking at REM sleep gone really wrong. Tell us about REM sleep behavior disorder.
Well, as I've written in my blog for the World Science Festival and also in my books, my entire career practicing sleep medicine has been involved with extreme sleep, which are the parasomnias defined as the abnormal behaviors and experiences that accompany sleep. And really the parasomnias involve mixed states of sleep and wakefulness, which are very hazardous experiences because if you're interacting with the actual environment with a lot of your brain still asleep, you're really setting yourself up to injuring yourself or anyone in your vicinity. So also with the parasomnias, our basic instincts can be released, and I'm talking about all our basic instincts. Sexual behavior, feeding behavior, aggression, violence, exploration, locomotion. Everything we can do in our waking lives can become unleashed in a very inappropriate way during our sleep. So on September 11th, 1982, when I started my practice of sleep medicine, the second patient I saw was a gentleman from Golden Valley, Minnesota named Donald Dorff. And Don complained of violent moving nightmares, which is a beautiful description of REM sleep behavior disorder. For several years, he was acting out dreams that were very different from his previous dreams. During his RBD dreams, he was being confronted by unfamiliar people or even animals, and he had to respond by hitting back or becoming very aggressive to protect himself or his wife. He would also have sports dreams that were very aggressive, and in fact, the dream that he had that led to his coming to see me was a dream involving American football. He was a halfback carrying the ball through the line of scrimmage, and he lowered his shoulder to really anticipate an impact with a 280-pound lineman. And when he came to, he had actually lowered his shoulder into the dresser on the far side of his bedroom, and his head hit the wall, and he gashed himself and really needed a lot of stitches after all the blood had spilled on the ground. He had no medical disorder, no psychiatric disorder. He had never been a sleepwalker earlier in his life, so this is the first type of parasomnia he had experienced. 5 nights later, I decided to go to the sleep lab to be with the sleep technologist when we monitored him in the sleep lab, and we saw something that was really unprecedented, that during rapid eye movement sleep, instead of displaying the usual mammalian paralysis, which protects people and other mammals from acting out their dreams, Don had lost that paralysis, and he had muscle tone, muscle twitching, and during each of his 4 REM sleep episodes, he actually was twitching, jerking around, throwing punches, kicking, talking, shouting, swearing, and when we entered the room after each of these events, he reported immediately a dream, and the action in the dream matched what we had seen. So there's a beautiful correspondence between the dream activity that he was acting out and the behaviors that we observed. And that was really the beginning of our identification of REM sleep behavior disorder known as RBD. Now, fortunately, we were able to come out with a medication through trial and error to calm him down. And what was interesting is that the medication clonazepam, which is a potent benzodiazepine anticonvulsant, that medication not only stopped the behaviors of RBD, but it restored normal dreams. And so that has really piqued the interest of dream researchers because RBD is a dream disorder almost as much as a behavior disorder of sleep. So in terms of conceptualizing dream generation, RBD is a really fertile area for research. And so with Don, his bad dreams had gone away along with the bad behaviors, and he was a very happy camper to play golf in his retirement. Now, as we started seeing more and more of these patients, and they were being reported around the world, after a certain number of years, we realized that a lot of these men with REM behavior disorder developed Parkinson's disease, which is a classic neurologic disorder involving a resting tremor, muscle rigidity, slowed down movements called bradykinesia, and also poor stability of your posture. So there are really well-defined signs and symptoms of Parkinson's disease, which involves a depletion of dopamine cells in the brainstem area called the substantia nigra. Now, we reported in the journal Neurology in 1996 that 38% of the men with REM behavior disorder eventually converted to Parkinson's disease and nothing else. Now we're up to 81% conversion from REM behavior disorder to Parkinson's disease, and centers from around the world are reporting that at least 2/3 of their patients convert. So really, this is actually an important development in neuroscience and neurology in terms of early intervention of people at risk for future Parkinson's disease. And so this has launched really a major international effort in terms of identifying REM sleep behavior disorder patients and trying to develop trials of what's called neuroprotective agents to delay greatly or even prevent the future emergence of Parkinson's disease. I should also point out that all this makes scientific sense because the cells in the brainstem related to Parkinson's disease interact very, very closely with the cells in the brain involved with muscle activity and the paralysis activity of REM sleep. So a lesion that interrupts the paralysis activity in REM sleep is a lesion that also can produce Parkinson's disease. It's just a matter of exactly where that initial lesion is, and you either get REM behavior disorder first and maybe a decade or two later Parkinson's disease, or you get Parkinson's disease first and later REM behavior disorder, or you get both together. So I think that that was a major kind of scientific revelation about RBD. The good news for us is that we identified a therapy that helped control these poor people hurting themselves and their wives and also restored normal dreams. I think we should show the image of Mel Abel, really our most famous patient who almost killed his wife. Now, Mel was just the nicest guy in the world. He had a dream one night, and this is how he slept for 5 years before he came to see us. This is a home remedy. He had a belt around his waist. He had a rope tethered around his belt attached to the bedpost. And this is his way of preventing himself from flying out of bed and running into the wall. However, it did not prevent him from hurting his wife, Harriet. So one night he had a dream going back to his childhood days in Spooner, Wisconsin. He was with his grandfather. They were pitching hay, and they saw 2 deer running by them. And then the deer disappeared, and then suddenly a doe reappeared, and Mel smashed the doe with his pitchfork, and it stunned the deer that was blathering, and he decided to put that poor deer out of its misery. So in his dream, he grabbed the deer's chin with one hand and the top of the deer's head with the other. It was about to snap its neck when Harriet's screaming woke Mel up, and fortunately, he stopped the process of almost snapping Harriet's neck. Well, obviously, he was extremely distressed, and so was Harriet by this. That, you know, it's...
Clearly.
And in fact, Stern magazine wrote an article in 1988 called Hunting Deer Under the Blanket, and the New York Times Sunday magazine in 2003 called it The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Deer. So extremely dangerous and life-threatening behaviors can occur with RBD. The good news is that we can treat it. The disturbing news is that it can lead to Parkinson's disease, but the hopeful news is that it can lead to early intervention to prevent the progression to Parkinson's disease, because the Parkinson's researchers for decades have been looking for the earliest marker of Parkinson's, and RBD is it. So it's generated a tremendous amount of interest in the Parkinson's disease research community, and we now have an international REM sleep behavior disorder research group, and it's truly international. 4 continents are involved in researchers, and so we're really trying to help the Parkinson's researchers besides understanding more about the brain during sleep. I think we can go to the video now, and I can show you some examples of RBD and other parasomnias. So this is from our sleep center. These men who are typically 50 years old and older. We don't know why this is a male-predominant disorder, by the way. That's a big mystery. But this is what they do. And if you're sleeping by him as this man's wife, you know, these men generally wake up feeling rested in the morning. The wives are wiped out, completely wiped out. And the husbands say, why are you so tired? Didn't you sleep well like me? And they said, what do you mean? Look what you did. So these men, they remember their dreams, but they don't know that they were acting them out, and they feel rested in the morning. So I'm going to show this again. So imagine if you're the wife, sleeping night after night, and these episodes occur 4 or 5 nights a week. So you treat the man with this clonazepam, and it's like giving the wife a sleeping pill as well, because she sleeps like a baby after his sleep is under control. But a lot of these patients come to us saying, we want to be believed, we want to be validated. People think we're exaggerating. And in fact, they're not, and the video really is proof that there's no exaggeration here. So let's go to the next video. This is a culture-specific dream and acting behavior from Japan. My colleague Nana Tachibana in Osaka. Apparently in Japan, once a couple has a child, the wife leaves the bedroom with the child, the husband sleeps alone, and REM behavior disorder is detected basically by yelling and screaming. So this man had a dream. He set up a home video, and he's the samurai warrior, acting out a samurai warrior dream. Maybe we can show that one again, please. So here he is, and he only set up the video because he did not believe his wife. And he said, all right, let's set it up, and here's the proof. And in fact, he had to believe that his wife was telling the truth.
Now, how long will he be doing this? Will he go at this all night long?
Well, he killed the enemy, so he doesn't have to do it again. Right?
What's the point?
He did it enough to disturb his wife. So let's shift gears to another parasomnia now. And this is sleepwalking. So this is from delta non-REM sleep, the deepest stage of sleep. The brain waves are the slowest. We should show this again if we could. So out of the deepest stage of sleep, when we have no clue about our environment, our locomotor system gets activated. Our legs start moving. We start standing and walking without any actual awareness of the environment. And you can see how dangerous it is. There she is, Sandy, in our sleep lab, about to fall out of the bed. Her legs are moving, but she has no idea why, and it's so inappropriate. I should give an anecdote of a patient of mine named Jan, who was a sleepwalker as long as she was walking in her life. That's how she described it. So after her divorce, her 9-year-old daughter slept in the same room as Jan, and so in preparation for sleep at night, the shades were drawn completely. But then the daughter was horrified. A few hours later, the mother, Jan, had raised the blinds halfway, was looking out the window. Now, across the street from their home was a cemetery. Jan was carrying on a conversation with the dead people in the cemetery, asking them, who's feeding you? What are they feeding you? Do you feel lonely? And there was a pause between the questions, and the daughter realized she was engaging in a conversation with the dead people in the cemetery in her own mind. She asked her mother at the time, are you awake? And Jan, in a very glazed way, said, yes. Well, the daughter was so horrified by this that she never slept in the same room with the mother again. And in fact, didn't even mention this until she was a teenager. And my patient, of course, felt very, very badly. But that tells you how you don't have judgment. You don't have the monitor going in terms of your activity while you're sleepwalking. You're engaging yourself in sleepwalking behaviors with the environment, but you don't have any awareness. You don't really realize how inappropriate you are. We can go to the next video now. These are 2 patients with...
This could be scary.
This is very scary.
So are these night terrors?
They seem like night terrors. The first was a woman in her early 30s. Second is a young girl, 5 years old, screaming at night very loudly. However, these occurred multiple times every single night. Night terrors, even in children who are really most likely to have night terrors, maybe once a week, once a month, but to have multiple episodes every night tells you that something else is going on, and these are nocturnal epileptic seizures, known as the great mimickers. So if you have screaming at night and thrashing around, they could be night terrors, but the history of having multiple episodes every single night really tips the balance towards epileptic seizures, and in fact the brainwave activity in both the woman and in the young girl gave good evidence that there was epileptic activity going on, and they needed anticonvulsant medication rather than a clonazepam, which is a benzodiazepine medication. We can go to the next video if we could. Now, this is a completely different parasomnia. We're going to show this a second time. This is a 23-year-old woman who had been sexually abused during childhood by an older sister. And if you look at her shoulders, and we'll show it again, the shoulders seem to be pinned down while there's a lot of pelvic movement. And this really reflects muscle memory going over 2 decades of the sister pinning her down on her shoulders to prevent this poor young girl from running away while there's genital stimulation going on. And here we are talking 2 decades later, and she's recreating the abuse scenario of the shoulders being pinned down and the pelvic stimulation. And this is really a very disturbed kind of poor young woman who needs specialized psychiatric care. But it's in the realm of parasomnias, but it's a psychiatric parasomnia. Okay, we can go to the next video. This is a lady who engages in sleep-related eating disorder, but please focus on her pinky, because her pinky does something very peculiar every time she takes a bite out of her brownie. First of all, the pinky is spread out from the other fingers, which is unusual in itself, but she seems to be nibbling at her pinky and doing funny things. When she saw this video, she said, "I never eat that way when I'm awake. Never." But with each bite of the brownie, let's show her again if we could. So we call this sleep state dependent behavior activation. So it's specific to the sleep state. And it really indicates that this is not normal wakeful eating. So she takes a bite of the brownie, and there goes the pinky. So you know this is not someone who's fully with it in a wakeful mental mode whatsoever. This comes out of intermediate non-REM sleep called stage 2 sleep. And this is typical of sleep-related eating disorder. Most patients have episodes every single night, and they gain weight and they feel very much out of sorts from this eating behavior. And this is called a final common pathway disorder that can be accessed through sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, medications like sleeping pills, or it can just run in the family and be a variation of sleepwalking. But once it becomes well established, it usually occurs every single night, and with a lot of metabolic consequences, obesity consequences, and sleep disruption consequences. And this is one of the tougher parasomnias to treat, although about 2/3 of the treated patients do respond very well to the therapy, but you have to know what the underlying or associated sleep condition is, like sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, to identify the most effective therapy. But you already got a glimpse of how our basic instincts can be released inappropriately during sleep. Later on, I will describe a very dramatic case that made Canadian legal history involving sleepwalking and murder, and I will also describe sexomnia. But I think we need to move on.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Now, in terms of extreme sleep, you know, we might have a sort of a little contest going here. You've got extreme human sleep, but I think Neil's has got some extreme animal sleep that is pretty amazing. I mean, just in terms of like, why don't you just tell people about these birds, particular birds you've been starting to study, like in the wild?
Yeah, so recent technological advancements in microchip technology developed by a colleague in the University of Zurich, Alexei Vysotsky, has allowed us to actually record brain activity and sleep-related brain activity in animals in the wild. And this is important for 2 reasons. One, we did the first study of an animal sleeping in the wild. In this case, it was a sloth. And we found that sloths are not so slothful after all. People previously thought they slept 16 hours a day. Some people said 20 hours a day. But when we recorded their brain activity in the wild, we found they only slept 9.5 hours a day, over 6 hours less than captive sloths. So that finding in and of itself is important because it calls into question, you know, the nature of sleep that we're recording in captivity or in the laboratory, at least in terms of how long an animal sleeps.
There might not be too much to do in the lab, so
yeah,
might not get sleep.
We don't exactly know the reason for this difference, and I think it can even go the other way, that some animals might be particularly fearful in the laboratory and sleep less than they do in the wild. But it could be differences, and they don't have to forage, they don't Some animals may feel safe in the lab, and some may feel threatened. So I think it can go in each direction.
But to study things in the wild, I mean, you have to take all this equipment that it's easy to use in the lab, and you've got to take it outside and to some pretty extreme places.
Yeah, it is tricky. Our laboratory becomes a tent on a remote island, or the back of a pickup truck in the rainforest in Panama. But the birds that we're really interested in studying now do some extraordinary things. There are several species that you'll see in this image that engage in periods of continuous activity lasting days, weeks, months, maybe even longer. There's a bird in the upper left corner, the bar-tailed godwit. It's been shown that they fly nonstop for 8 days from Alaska to New Zealand, where they spend the winter.
And we actually have a map, I believe.
Yeah,
and there's take a look at that map.
And this is showing a GPS track. They put a device on these birds that could tell exactly where they were. And you can see Alaska up on the top of the globe, and they start there and they fly all the way to New Zealand without stopping at all. And then they make comparable long flights on the way back, going via China in this case. So this raises the question, well, how do they get their sleep? In every other animal, sleep seems to be a daily phenomena and very important, as we all know, and as I know, being quite jet-lagged today.
You're doing great. What happens if you try to keep a bird awake for a long time? I mean, does it just say, please leave me alone, I need sleep? I mean...
Yeah, and we've actually recently shown with pigeons that if you take away just their normal daytime napping, that they become very sleepy, and when we let them sleep and record their brain activity, they sleep much more deeply. So the brainwave patterns respond just like they do in humans. And also, we've shown that if you stimulate one part of the brain, in this case we had birds watch David Attenborough's The Life of Birds on TV with just one eye.
Oh, that's not fair.
We just covered one eye and showed them the show. And the part of the brain connected to that eye that watched the TV slept much more deeply. So just like I had mentioned in humans, the sleep seems to be regulated in the bird brain dependent on how different regions were used. So sleep is clearly important for birds. They need to recover, and their brain responds the same way ours does. But then if we can go back, in addition to this bird, the bar-tailed godwit, there are other birds that engage in long flights. The frigate bird on the top right, they go to sea to feed for several days, lasting periods up to 12 days. But surprisingly, for a seabird, frigate birds cannot land on the water. If they do, they get wet and they can't take off and they drown, and that's it. And so they go out to sea foraging for days or weeks and can't sit on the water. So then again, the question of, do they sleep? They're also, unlike our swifts here, the European swift is renowned for engaging in long flights. It's thought that other than the time when they're actually taking care of the nestlings, that these swifts are flying continuously. It's even been shown they put that on their first night out, the first night they leave the nest, first time they've ever flown, they actually go up into the sky and spend the night soaring up in the night sky with all the adult birds. And it's thought that from that point on, they may not land until they nest 2 or 3 years later. And so, when do they sleep? Mm-hmm. And there's also a bird, ironically, called the wide-awake tern. It's ironic because it's called that because its call sounds like it's saying, wide awake, wide awake. It's not because scientists have actually shown that it's wide awake, but Maybe it's telling us something.
These birds, they give you lots of clues.
They're like the frigate birds. They go out to sea, but they can't sit on the water. They'll get wet and drown. So again, when do they sleep? And finally, a bird that I'm flying to Alaska to study tomorrow morning at 4 a.m. is the one on the lower left, the pectoral sandpiper. And this bird doesn't engage in long, nonstop flights, but we have some reason to believe that they engage in periods of constant activity during the breeding season. Colleagues at our institute have shown that they're active for 2 to 3 weeks continuously, around the clock, 24/7. And in this case, they seem to be doing it to get mates. The male shown here, he stays awake and he chases all the other males away from his females and guards his territory. Whereas the females, they seem to sleep like other birds for several hours a night. So we suspect that they're not sleeping, but we want to confirm this by recording their brain activity.
And so you're going to be, you've developed equipment where you can do this, where you can actually...
Yeah, working with colleagues that developed the microchip technology, we can record their brain activity. And we've actually tested it on these birds a couple of years ago. So that it's all ready to go, and we just need to collect the data. And I think, you know, on the one hand, if some of these birds are sleeping in flight, that's fascinating, and maybe they're sleeping with one half of the brain at a time. But it's these birds that might also engage in extended periods of not sleeping that might be the really exciting ones. Because, again, it would just challenge what we know and think about sleep in general as being so important. And it would raise the question, well, how are they doing it? What is going on in their brains that allow them to suspend sleep for this long period of time? And if we can learn how they're doing this, that might tell us something about the purpose of sleep in general. So we're not just studying these because they're cool and interesting animals, but they might actually tell us something important about what sleep is doing for our brain.
So we have a little time left, but Carlos, you've talked about murder and sex. We cannot let you leave before you satisfy
people
us.
ask you what I do for a living.
Yeah.
I say, well, I deal with out-of-control eating, sex, and aggression. I get paid for it, and I do a video, and I don't get arrested for it either, you know. So
nice work if you can get it.
So we can show the image of Kenneth Parks. Kenneth James Parks, age 24, 6'5" tall, 280 pounds. The night of May 24th, 1987, he was sitting in front of his TV in the living room, had fallen asleep. He woke up, put on his shoes, grabbed the set of car keys, left the house, leaving the front door completely wide open, got in his car, left, leaving the garage door completely open. He drove through the streets of Toronto, 23 kilometers, which is 14 miles, went to the home of his in-laws, Barbara Woods and Donald Woods, and in the garage he took out a tire iron, went upstairs to their bedroom. He nearly strangled his father-in-law, Donald Woods, before he went to his mother-in-law, Barbara Woods. He smashed her with a tire iron. She had brain bleeding, but he stabbed her 6 times with a kitchen knife, and the stab through the heart killed her. He then went to the door, outside the door, the 2 doors of their teenage daughters, and they reported later that he was grunting in a very loud way like an animal. And it was terrifying, because then he stopped grunting, and then he started again. Fortunately, he did not enter their room. He left the home, walked into a police station at 4:45 in the morning, and he said, "I think I killed somebody. I don't know what happened. I saw the face of Barbara Woods. It looked very sad to me, but I don't know what happened. I think I did something terrible." The police made a very important observation. He had cut the tendons of all his fingers, the flexor tendons. In the process of stabbing his mother-in-law and his father-in-law, the kitchen knife must have slipped through his fingers, and he cut the flexor tendons. He showed no pain. He felt no pain. And in the subsequent trial, that was very important evidence to indicate that he was not really with it, not awake. Because people, if they're awake, will have incredible pain after cutting basically 10 tendons of your hands. Now, he was acquitted in the trial that began a year later, and this made Canadian legal history the first time the sleepwalking defense was successfully used in a murder case. Now, people will say, how could this be? Well, the evidence was really compelling. I reviewed the 1,737-page court transcript, which I analyzed in my book, Paradox Lost. And basically, I think the jury got it right. First of all, he had a sleepwalking history. At the age of 11, his mother caught him as he was about to leave the 6th-floor window of their dwelling. I mean, he would have killed himself. He was always known to be a very, very deep sleeper. He also had an incredible family history of sleepwalking. 20 first-degree and second-degree family relatives had parasomnias. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And covering 4 different parasomnias: sleepwalking, sleep terror, sleep talking, and also sleep-related eating disorders. So he had the incredible family history, he had the personal history, and on top of that, he had 3 major precipitating factors for people with a vulnerability to sleepwalking. The first factor was that he had been sleep-deprived 48 hours, which is a known risk factor for sleepwalkers. Second of all, he had major physical stress. He had played rugby on a very hot and humid afternoon in Toronto, and he was incredibly out of shape. So that's what we call a physical stress. And third, he had emotional stress. He had been a gambler, had gotten into major debt, and that was really weighing on him and really having an adverse effect on their marriage. Also, in the kind of witch's brew of his sleepwalking mind, the next day, he had organized a picnic, a barbecue at his in-laws' house. So in the sleepwalking mind, he was driving to his in-laws. He just happened to do it maybe 12 hours too soon in the wrong state of mind, in other words, the sleepwalking mind. How the violence and the murder entered in, we don't know, but basically he had no motivation to kill his in-laws, and in fact, when he first met his future wife, Karen, she was a teenage runaway, and he convinced her to go back to her parents. So his in-laws were immensely appreciative of him because he helped rescue their runaway daughter, told her, go back to your parents. He eventually married them, and they considered him like a son. In fact, Barbara Woods called him my gentle giant. And in fact, he murdered her. So there was really no reason at all for motive for murder. He had been a sleepwalker, he had the risk factors for that night, and he had the family history. And for that reason, the jury, I think, got it right by acquitting him. The prosecution in Canada can appeal a murder trial, unlike the United States. And on appeal, the acquittal was sustained. It was basically supported. And unfortunately, I heard that down the road, he eventually did get divorced. I think it was just too much of a strain on your marriage when your wife realizes, you killed my mother, you almost killed my father. Although apparently he did well with clonazepam as therapy of his sleepwalking. But I think this is an extreme example of sleepwalking, but it's unintentional behavior with tragic consequences. And obviously sleepwalkers should avoid the precipitating factors in terms of sleep deprivation, physical stress, and deal with their emotional stress the best way possible. Let me conclude my section by talking about sexsomnia. Now, in relation to RBD, REM behavior disorder, I think Sigmund Freud would have been very disappointed. He would have said, my God, what a great opportunity for sexual acting out. You're dreaming in REM sleep, you don't have the paralysis, let the games begin. But the reality is, there is no sexual acting out with REM behavior disorder. In fact, there's a bias against sexual dreams. There's a bias for aggressive dreams, locomotion dreams, sports dreams, but there's a bias against sexual dreams, and this has been demonstrated in a very nice controlled study from Italy. But with sexsomnia, actually, it's during non-REM sleep when there is no dreaming. And it really covers the whole gamut of sexuality in terms of sleep sex talking, masturbation, sexual assault, including rape, including legal cases involving children and adults. And this appears to be a male-predominant disorder, although we really don't know for sure. It's just that the women complain about the men engaging in sexsomnia, and they're the ones who come for help. The men generally don't complain about their partners. And this is really a sociological question, I would say, much more than a medical question. And years ago, the Kinsey report kind of had a golden opportunity, but it did not address any issue of sexual behaviors during sleep, just sexual dreams. But sexsomnia, also known as sleep sex, can really be associated either with a long history of sleepwalking, night terrors, sleep-related eating. In other words, it comes at the end of a long history of non-rapid eye movement sleep parasomnias, or it's associated with sleep apnea. People snore, and it's called snorgasm, by the way, among, we believe in really precise terminology. We have sex apnea and snorgasm, but you have snoring and sexual behavior, and for the bed partner, the snoring is just as disconcerting as the sexual behavior. You say, my God, having sex when your partner is snoring, what is going on here? But it really reflects what's called a confusional arousal. When you snore, you have a partial awakening, again, a mixed state of sleep and wakefulness with very inappropriate behaviors. So during this mixed state, induced by the sleep apnea, you can engage in eating behavior, aggressive behavior, or sexual behavior. So the typical scenario for sexsomnia is either a long history of other parasomnias or a relatively recent history of sexsomnia with sleep apnea. And the good news, like with most of the parasomnias, they can be effectively treated after being properly diagnosed. So I think with sexsomnia, there's a very dramatic parasomnia, but it fits in with the whole realm of other parasomnias and the release of instinctual behaviors, but the field of sleep medicine can diagnose patients and treat effectively most of the patients. And for me as a physician, this has been the most gratifying part, besides all the discoveries. It's really treating patients, making them happy, making their bed partners happy, allowing them to live during the daytime without any adverse consequences from sleep gone bad.
So just in order to wrap things up, let's kind of look to the future. How about each of you take a minute or two just to tell me what question you want to know the answer to about sleep. What is the burning question that you would really love to know? Let's start with you, Niels.
Can I sleep on it? I don't know. We've talked about REM sleep, and we've focused on the brainwave patterns and what characterizes them. But there are other aspects of REM sleep that occur, again, both in mammals and in birds that don't get much attention. One of them is, for some unclear reason during REM sleep, we stop thermoregulating. Birds who are hot while they're sleeping will pant during non-REM sleep, but when they enter REM sleep, they stop. Similar things happen in mammals. So what is the purpose of this aspect of REM sleep is not getting much attention.
So what about you, Matt?
Well, I think the fundamental question, it's the question of, how do we learn? How do we build these models of the world? How do we...
So you see sleeping as learning?
Sleeping is learning. In fact, just listening to these other presentations that really focused on behaviors that can occur during certain kinds of dream sleep, non-REM sleep, and I was making the connection between quiet wakefulness and sort of thinking and non-REM dreaming. And I realized it was important to point out that there's this kind of connection that we've made between sleeping, in particular non-REM sleep, and inactivity. Now, during thinking, when you're sitting and thinking, it turns out, even in animals, they can think perfectly well when they're sitting quietly doing nothing, or engaged in automatic behaviors that don't require attention, that include eating, having sex. Turns out that's, their minds can wander when they have sex as well. So it's that there's this state that involves thinking while you can still engage in automatic behavior. That can include things like driving. There are systems in the brain that are built to take over automatic behavior. And when we're not doing that, we can be thinking about other things. Non-REM sleep may carry all of the same baggage along with it, the ability to do things while you are thinking about other things. So it's this connection between thinking, sleeping, dreaming, and learning. And so the question, a burning question I have, is it possible to show that what we dream influences what we do, not the other way around, which is the way we tend to think about it. We dream about what we remember. Well, is it possible that what we dream about actually changes how we learn, how we behave? And there are these interesting connections between memory, the areas of the brain involved in memory, and imagination. Our ability to remember the past is linked to our ability to imagine the future. So you can think of dreams as a way, I mean, I don't know what kind of future you imagine with your crazy cacti, but you can think of dreams in a way, they are a process of imagining a world and perhaps anticipating a world in which we are going to have to interact with. And so the connection between not just memory, not just learning, but creativity, imagination, all of these things that we believe define what we are as uniquely sentient, intelligent beings. So it's deeply embedded in my sense that sleep is revealing something about what makes us unique and intelligent.
I would echo what Matt was talking about, that I'm very curious about all the benefits of sleep on our waking lives, because we know that disturbed sleep has adverse effects on our waking lives. So I'm really curious about the whole range, the whole panorama of the benefits of good sleep on our waking lives, so we can enhance it, quite honestly. And if in fact there are creatures out there that don't really need sleep, what is it about their wakefulness that is so intrinsically good for them that they don't need sleep? So I think that's an open question as well.
Great. Well, let's give a hand to our panelists and wish them a good night's sleep.